This is Gary Atencio with CNTV, and today we're in Texas. I'm here with an award-winning health psychologist and author who understands that motherhood is challenging, but a mother's mental and physical health are essential to make it easier. I'm joined here with the author and public speaker, Kathleen Kendall-Tacket. Thanks so much for joining us here today.
Thanks for having me.
I'm going to start off a little bit about yourself. You were a health psychologist and the director of Precarious Press. For the past decade, you have been editor-in-chief of Psychological Trauma. You specialize in women's health research, and you have won many awards for your work. Share with us how the writing of over 500 articles, 42 books, really has now led you to the topic of breastfeeding.
Yeah, it's my primary area of research is actually in family violence, sexual assault, but I became interested in perinatal mental health. And the breastfeeding part was just something that sort of just flowed out of some volunteer experience that I was doing. I wasn't necessarily going to study it, but it was kind of a nice counterpart to the kind of pretty serious topics that I was covering in research. And then people were kind of starting to ask me if I'd speak on those. And so that's how those two kind of ended up melding, because the breastfeeding actually really was more just a personal interest, and personal experience that led to volunteer work, as a peer counselor, and then eventually as a IBCLC, which is the International Board Certified Lactation Consultant. And that's I started kind of just studying some of the aspects of it, bringing this psychological framework to it. So I kind of was pretty much the only one doing that for a long time. I was putting breastfeeding and psychology together. Now I've got actually some young colleagues that are kind of coming up in the pipeline and have kind of taken it over, which is great.
So in your volunteering, you've seen this firsthand. According to the stats of the CDC, over 80% of infants born in the U.S. initiated breastfeeding. So not only is it a natural instinct, really, for infants, is it natural for mothers to want to breastfeed, would you say?
I would say our biology sort of gears us toward that, but there's a lot of things in the way we handle birth and that support afterwards that kind of can override those natural instincts, if you will. People think, okay, well, if you have instincts that if I hand you an infant, you're going to know exactly what to do. And really, that's not really accurate, because, women kind of throughout history in cultures where there was breastfeeding, you saw it all the time, and you kind of pick it up by osmosis. You learn things, by that. And we don't have it. So many of our moms have never seen it before. And they think, well, I don't know what to do. I must not have any maternal instincts. And that's actually not true, because there's a lot of things that kind of can interfere with it. And some of it is just bad information. People a lot of times get some very bad information.
Breastfeeding offers numerous benefits for both the mother and the babies. We're talking about ideal nutrition. It boosts the immune system. It can even lower the risk of various illnesses and diseases. Is breastfeeding gaining in popularity as we start to understand the science behind it?
It's kind of funny because in some ways there's more sort of public enthusiasm for it. But if anything, there was this one really nice study that looked at pediatricians. They've actually lost confidence in it. Many of them don't actually believe. They say all the right things, but they don't actually believe it will work. And yes, there's been kind of a more of a public push, but the support that's needed hasn't really come after that. And so you'll get people saying, hey, listen, I got this material that came from the formula companies. Here's a coupon, or here's some instructional materials just in case. And so what they're communicating to this very vulnerable mother is, this is probably not going to work.
The loudest voice in the room always gets heard, and a lot of those companies have a lot of money to push that word out there. Sadly, healthcare systems can often undermine breastfeeding and even mental health. Is it important that we educate ourselves with evidence-based material?
Absolutely. And I think probably one of the biggest areas of misunderstanding between psychologists and breastfeeding advocates is their understanding of mother-infant sleep. Because, psychologists come along and they'll say, well, sleep is important. You want to make sure she has uninterrupted sleep. And that's good advice for the general population. But as it turns out, it is not good advice for breastfeeding mothers because that kind of advice, like, you'll see mental health providers that will say stuff like, well, we should not breastfeed at night. You should have somebody else take care of the baby so you can get sleep. But what they're not understanding is that exclusively breastfeeding mothers actually get more sleep. That's actually one of the things that we studied, but there were like several other researchers who found exactly the same thing. And it seems very counterintuitive.
Interesting.
And I think partly it's because they do have more interrupted sleep, but they get back to sleep quicker and they go into deeper sleep. And so they kind of sync with their babies, and so they'll be up and they'll feed during the night, and then they can go right back to sleep. Versus if you have to get up and wake up and turn the lights on and go, you're wide awake, and it takes a long time to get back to sleep. So when people try to help by saying, "Oh, let somebody else handle the nighttime feedings," they're actually really undermining the protection that's kind of built in for mothers. So really a crucial question when you're asking about sleep with a new mom is how is that mom feeding her baby? Because that should really change the advice. And it's like you can sometimes just do some problem solvings with mom because, like I had one mom, she was feeding her baby at night, but she was exhausted. And I was kind of like, okay, so tell me, where is the baby sleeping? And she had the baby in the bassinet clear across on the other end of the room. Okay, so in the room, but not next to her. And so every time that she heard the baby cry, she had to actually physically get up out of bed, walk over, and pick up the baby and take him back. And that was not only waking her up, but honestly, that's kind of a dangerous thing to do because when you're groggy like that, you can trip over something, and that unfortunately has happened. So it's kind of like sometimes what you really need to do is just find out what they're doing and then kind of have a hack. Kind of like say, okay, if you have them near you, then you don't have to do that. You can get up and, it's easier for you to get the baby to hear the baby but without having to absolutely wake up. So there's like different things you can do, but it is something that I find is just a fundamental, uh, I don't know, territory or turf war between psychologists and breastfeeding folks because they don't really understand how a breastfeeding mother's sleep differs from that of the general population.
I mean, breastfeeding, safe to say, many attempt it, but not all are successful or they stick with it. Are the challenges different really for everyone, would you say?
There's a lot of similarities and challenges. One of the biggest things that makes a difference is social support. But unfortunately, I think we have a lot of people who are well meaning that they're actually kind of undermining. Like your mom or your mother in law hanging over your shoulder saying, "Is he eating again? Didn't he just eat?" So that really kind of undermines a mom's confidence. They're trying to actually help, but they're actually not helping. Or when they come in and they take over baby care, and then you're left to do the things like make the dinner and get the snacks. I mean, so it's kind of like people don't have, I think, a very good idea of what makes good social support, and partner support is really critical. And a lot of times when we do breastfeeding education, we don't really include the partner in that, and a lot of partners will actually say, I feel really left out, and really the most effective is when the partners work as a team. That's something they've just kind of found over and over and over again in studies. But also, too, did they support the mother first? That has to be the first thing. What does the mother want to do? What are her goals? What are her needs right now? And when they have that, all the other stuff, the encouragement and everything else, the information actually increases breastfeeding rates. But if you don't have that essential, empathy and support of the mother, it actually undermines it, lowers the rates. So again, I think some of it is a misunderstanding of what is good support. One of the weird things that we learned during COVID, which I thought was actually really interesting, is that because lactation consultants couldn't see mothers in person, we had to do a lot of this stuff virtually. And actually, I've had many just report back to me, just kind of anecdotally, that they found it actually worked better because they had to have the partner there to help them. The partner was there holding up the screen. Oh, here, tilt it down so I can see it. Hey, do you think you can actually do this? Get the baby in this position. And so then suddenly the mom and her partner were working together as a team. Because a lot of times, when you're in person, honestly, it's very easy to kind of just reach over and kind of, and it's not considered best practice, but sometimes you just can't help yourself, honestly. But you couldn't do that when you were kind of virtual. And again, there were some problems with the first one, but that was one thing that kind of appeared. And I thought that really changes how we should be discussing how to involve, partners, which are the primary source of support.
Kathleen, as your book states, breastfeeding doesn't need to suck. Is this a really a how-to in navigating for the new mother?
It is a how to. And what I really try to focus on are the benefits for breastfeeding on the mother. It's kind of like the benefits of breastfeeding on the infant. Everybody knows those, but a lot of times they don't necessarily know how it benefits moms. And that I think was an important kind of message to get across because, so many women say, well, gosh, I'm just doing this and I'm feeling like a cow. And they just look at this that they're delivering a product. And I mean, the cow analogy is not completely wrong, but it's kind of like it's not the way I think a lot of people like to think about themselves. And I really wanted them to see, that this incredible symbiotic relationship between mothers and babies, and what benefits the baby also benefits the mother. And a lot of times people don't know that.
Obviously, Mother Nature knows best, and that's still it's a natural way to do things. At 354 pages, does this contain information that may not be found in other breastfeeding books, would you say? And why was it important for you to provide the full picture, including mental health?
Well, I'd say the mental health is actually kind of the key bit of this. It's the idea that, breastfeeding shouldn't be a miserable experience for mothers. And some moms will just tough it out and it's miserable the whole time and they hate it, and it's kind of like, no, 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 you don't have to do it that way, and in fact, we want to make it so it's a good experience, but I mean, again, sometimes people just get terrible advice, and so I meet moms. The editor actually came up with that title, my editor, but it's really kind of a title that describes it because that's what so many people have said. Oh, I tried it. God, it was just sucked. It was awful. It's kind of like, no, we don't want it to be because the mother is an important part of this equation, and so this idea that you just have to sort of sacrifice everything, just disappear. Yeah, in some ways, it's kind of true that, the baby's needs at a certain point are going to trump yours just because they're a helpless little being, when you're an adult. But that doesn't mean that the mother is not important. She's very important. And it's very important that we take care of her too. And that they also recognize that by breastfeeding, you're getting not only these short term effects, but you're getting some long term effects that last actually throughout women's lives. And that's, I think, a really important thing.
I definitely agree. I mean, you are an international board certified lactation consultant with more than 30 years of experience in both lactation and mental health. Can breastfeeding problems increase the risk of depression, anxiety, and other issues out there?
Absolutely. Yeah, there's no question about that. For one thing, they don't get the protection that breastfeeding actually causes, particularly exclusive breastfeeding. But the other thing is if it's, they're worried or they're very anxious, and they don't know if their baby's getting enough to eat, or they feel like they just had all these problems or they're having a lot of pain, that actually triggers the stress system, which is the thing that underlies, depression, anxiety, PTSD, pretty much all the mental health problems.
Yes. The book provides practical tips, okay, like breastfeeding's impact on sleep, safe and unsafe bed sharing, pain and low milk supply. There's even suggestions, like you say, for well-intentional partners, grandmothers, and friends who want to help. What has been some of the feedback that you've gotten back from folks who read the book?
Well, a lot of people really liked, something that I called the 5 eyes of new motherhood. And it was talking about kind of how mothers' internal thoughts can sometimes undermine them. And this is just something I kind of put together after, hearing from a lot of moms over the years. But also, we learned a lot about, like, for example, the impact of isolation and losing your sense of time during COVID and how that contributed to the post traumatic stress disorder of the lockdowns and stuff. And it's really relevant to what new mothers' experiences often are. They lose track of time. Is it day or is it night? You know, is it the weekday or the weekend? And they're isolated from other people. And this is stuff that kind of preys on your mind. They lose their sense of self. Who are they? They feel like they're incompetent. And so they can't do anything. And so oftentimes mothers will run from that because they just can't stand it. And I think one of the things that people have said was really helpful is just kind of naming this stuff. Because, I'll tell you honestly, the formula companies know this. They understand this. And they actually, are very good at the psychological part of this. So they'll put out ads and they'll say stuff like, "Do you want to get back to your old self again? Or you can be free." Because again, it can be very overwhelming. It's very intense. That's one of the other eyes. It's very intense. It's, 24/7, and it can be pretty overwhelming. And so formula companies kind of really prey on that. They prey on your identity. You can have more control over your schedule. You could do, and then, they promise a lot of wondrous things. The baby's going to start sleeping really well. We actually know that that is actually false, but they sell a good yarn, and a lot of people really believe that. And just like by naming a lot of those kind of internal processes, is that people were kind of like, "Oh my gosh, yeah, yeah, absolutely." That's been me. And so I've had people say that was actually the most helpful part of the whole book. It's just that. But again, trying to kind of like talk about some of this. And I think honestly, if we make them explicit with the mothers, we talk to them about it, people, like lighting our support, you can actually diffuse a lot of it.
Yes, definitely. I mean, as a father myself, I've experienced the process with my spouse many times. And I can say that quick latch on training that's given at the hospital, I mean, that's not enough. I mean, once you get home and you realize what you have to deal with, I mean, this should be required reading in any OB ward, I would say. I mean, improved infant formulas in the 19th century provide an alternative to breastfeeding. By the 20th century, breastfeeding started to be viewed negatively. I mean, let's face it, like you said, marketing by these formula companies is really what you're up against. Is there much false information that are confusing new mothers out there all the time?
Definitely, and I think some of it is just the promises of this, but, to really kinda understand kinda how formula got such a foothold, is it really you almost have to go back to the Industrial Revolution, and it's this whole idea that science was going to conquer everything, and so we wanna do things scientifically, and there was this kind of attitude in the time, something that really had infused much of psychology was, a school of thought called behaviorism. And it's this idea that, you could basically train people through a series of punishments and rewards. That the baby didn't really have any personality. The mother didn't either. And in fact, some of the early theorists said that mothers really weren't in the best position to raise their babies because they didn't have a scientific background. I mean, and so again, formula kind of got its foothold because doctors said that, "Oh yeah, we're going to make the special, set of ingredients for your baby." And they used the word formula because of the scientific aspect of it. And so for a while they were saying it's better than breast milk, which of course a lot of research has completely disproven. But this idea that you could measure it, you could control it, you could control the timing of it, you know, you sound like you've had a lot of experiences as a new dad, especially in those first few weeks. It's not very controllable. There's, babies will feed at all kind of random times, and it's like sometimes they'll go a couple hours, other times they're on every 15 minutes. It's just you honestly can't control that at the beginning. And it's like that's kind of important to know. It doesn't mean you're doing it wrong. It means it's just a normal part of kind of establishing that milk production. But formula comes along with these promises that, you goal is, and now, one of the big pushes, and this is, there was a paper looking at Instagram post that was just recent, and they were saying that most of them were kind of leaning toward the idea that formula will stop with infant crying, and actually formula will stop with, will help with sleep problems, and neither of them are probably true. Now, again, there are certain situations where formula is absolutely necessary. If for whatever reason mom is not making enough milk, we have to feed the baby. That's the first thing. Okay. But the way that the way breastfeeding gets kind of undermined, by this advertising is, in a lot of ways very false. And so, yeah, there's a lot of misinformation and, it's a constant fight. In fact, there's something in the breastfeeding world, it's called the WHO code, but it's the World Health Organization standards for the marketing of breast milk substitutes. And it was basically trying to kind of crack down on some of the really unethical things that were happening around the world, where they'd have people dressed up like nurses and going into poor areas, like particularly in Africa and Asia, and saying this is better, this is the modern way to feed your baby, and giving them just enough. that it was enough to dry up their milk supply. And then they were having to spend half of their monthly income on getting it. And a lot of babies die as a result.
Like you said, we need evidence-based information with attitude. And that's what you're providing there. Bottom line, and the bottom line is if these new mothers are not prepared, then mental health may suffer. And your book describes the 5 Is, obviously in detail. So where can the public find your book?
It's widely available, so it's on Amazon. You know, it's on you can get it probably from many bookstores, and we also sell it at our website, which is preclarispress.com. So, yeah, it's widely available. American Psychological Association also sells it.
Excellent. Kathleen, breastfeeding, when it's going well, can actually protect a mother's mental health. Your goal is helping mothers and babies come through it happy, healthy, and securely attached. Is this rewarding to share not only in book form, but also as a public speaker for you?
It's very rewarding. I mean, my career kind of went in a little different direction than I kind of anticipated when I got out of school. I didn't imagine that I'd be doing so much speaking and education to healthcare providers, but that's pretty much what I've been doing since 1994. And it's been really kind of exciting to see the helpers out there kind of change their views, and really bringing kind of evidence up. I'm trained as a researcher. That's what my PhD is in. And so it's kind of like I wanted to sort of translate that for clinicians to use, then to help them with their mothers. And so again, like I said, really kind of multiplying those effects, because I really honestly believe that if you can actually help mothers and babies through this transition, it has lifetime effects. It has lifetime effects for the mothers. It has lifetime effects for the babies. It really kind of sets the family up. And so it's a way to really kind of, minimize even,
Yep.
the adverse circumstances that are oftentimes in the world. It's like the man who came up with the 10 steps to successful breastfeeding for UNICEF, that he was saying it was basically it gave children, like, say, born in poverty, a chance to kind of not have the negative effects of that. It actually was an inoculation against those effects. I mean, it's really that powerful. But just the psychological effects of that and saying, but we wanted to make a good experience because if it's miserable for the mother, it does not do that.
As a father of many kids myself, I have seen that firsthand. I've seen the benefits, not only short term, but long term as well. Very great story. I'm hoping my viewers will go out there and find this book. Viewers, let's take a look at the bottom of the screen right there. What you're going to see is her website. On the website, you can learn more about this author and her many books and articles that she has penned since 1987. You can find her books on Amazon and on Preclarious Press in paperback or even in Kindle download. You too can learn how to nurture your baby and your mental health because breastfeeding doesn't need to suck. This is Gary Atencio with CNTV, and if you don't know, now you know.